Good afternoon, Your Honors.
Yes. You agree with me that every time the Constitution is invoked in a petition, it raises into question the existential question of the role of this court vis-a-vis the constitutional order. You would
Yes, Your
agree with
Honor.
me. And that the powers of this court evolve in relation to not only the words that we find in the Constitution, but the contemporary circumstances. Would you agree with me?
As I understand it, the Constitution is a living document, so I would agree with you, Your Honor.
Yes, and specifically that the model or the general pattern of our Constitution, starting from the 1935 Constitution, the American order of three separate branches and a very limited sense of judicial review is now different in the 1987 Constitution. Would you agree with me?
It has evolved, if Your Honor, please.
Yes, because in the 1935 and when in 1776, the Americans were drafting their constitution, which they extended to us through the McKinley Instructions and the 1900s bill, there was still no concern about the environment. Is that not correct?
That is true, Your Honor.
And specifically with the environment, it can be an incremental destruction of our environment, and only suddenly will we realize that there will be a qualitative change of the environment that we have. Isn't that true?
That is correct, Your Honor.
For example, the danger that we face now regarding climate change, which is part of the biggest ecological disaster or catastrophe that we are facing, has been the result of ages and generations of contributions to carbon, methane into our environment. And then only later, like today, we see heat waves hitting Europe, the kinds of temperatures that we suffered. So this is essentially incremental, and then suddenly we just notice the environmental destruction. Isn't that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And insofar as the West Philippine Sea is concerned, they did not construct the artificial installations in a day. Neither were the fishers coming from other places that use cyanide, etc. They did not come in droves, but they came in little by little. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And the situation in our country is that the president only has a term of 6 years, barring any constitutional change, of course, but it is definitely 6 years. Members of Congress have a term of 3 years, extendable, and members of the local governments 3 years. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And in terms of the period for environmental disasters, these are very short in relation to the seeing of the effects of an environmental catastrophe. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. So therefore, the only institution that survives perhaps longer than the terms of political officers is this court. Is that not correct?
That is very correct, Your Honor.
And with respect to this court and other courts, like the Court of Appeals, for instance, the Court of Appeals will always be thinking about what the Supreme Court's policy will be. And therefore, it is sometimes there are certain cases that are filed directly with the Supreme Court simply because of its novel, transcendental, complicated, and sensitive content. Is that not correct?
That is correct. In fact, I think that was an observation made by Your Honor in another Kalikasan case.
Yes, in Pahe.
Yes.
But the point there is that there are certain situations where a Court of Appeals, perhaps, or an appellate court or a regional trial court might not feel comfortable dealing with the issue because it needs the, let us say, the inputs of 15 individuals that have given an almost lifetime term to really sit back and think about the epistemic as well as the existential content of those issues. Is that not correct?
I would say the wisdom, Your Honor, of the highest members of the members of the High Court.
Yes, and it's up to the Supreme Court to deal with, for example, what it does with the case and the guidance that it will give to lower courts in case it is remanded or in case they constitute maybe the Court of Appeals as a commissioner to try the facts. Is that not correct?
It is within the authority and jurisdiction of the court, and under the internal rules, the court may in fact delegate reception of evidence to a lower court or to a
Yes.
justice.
Okay. Would you say that this is the type of case that should be tackled first by the Supreme Court and not initially by the Court of Appeals?
Definitely, Your Honor. We submit that we do not present any factual issues in this case.
But of course, the Solicitor General does not agree with you and wants to point out there may not be, let us say for the sake of argument, there may not be certain factual issues in relation to whether there has been ecological destruction in the Ayungin Shoal, the Mischief Reef or the Panganiban Reef, and the Scarborough, right? But certainly there is a factual issue with respect to what government has done. Is that not correct?
Well, if Your Honor, please, when we pored over the verified return submitted by the Solicitor General, it did not appear to controvert any of the allegations that we
For
made.
example, whether or not they indeed declared the area as a protected area, isn't that a factual issue?
Not in our view, if Your Honor, please.
Whether or not there were actually voyages that looked at that did marine research in order to be able to provide input as to the sustainable yield or whatever modern version it is important. Isn't that also a factual issue?
The central issue, Your Honor, that we are bringing before this court is the enforcement of the Fisheries Code environmental laws in the West Philippine Sea.
Yes, but before we
So-
can get to that, we need to determine for ourselves what government has done. And for instance, whether in fact there were actual fishers that were arrested and prosecuted and convicted. Isn't that also a factual issue?
Our petition, if Your Honor, please, alleges facts that took place and that are the subject of the memorial submitted by the Philippine government and of the arbitral award
Yes.
decided by the Permanent
Which-
Court of Arbitration,
Okay, which
took
showed
place.
the existence of environmental destruction in relation to Article 192 of the UNCLOS, definitely, but it did not show whether the government after July 2016 had done nothing, refused or omitted to do anything in relation to such environmental destruction. Would you agree with me?
Yes, when we looked over the verified return, if Your Honor, please, it did not controvert any of the allegations that were part of the submission or memorial of the Philippine government to
Okay.
the Permanent Court of Arbitration.
But let us assume that there are factual issues. Let us just assume that there are, okay, for the sake of argument. Where in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court cannot deal with a factual issue? Is there any provision in the Constitution, to your recollection, in Article 8, from Section 1, maybe even Section 5, where it actually says that the court cannot deal with a factual issue?
I am not aware of any. Your Honor.
In fact, it is in Rule 45, which is a rule of this court. Rule 45 says that only with questions of law can it deal with Rule 45. By the way,
That is
counsel,
for appeals by certiorari, Your Honor,
yes,
from the
it
Court
is an
of
appeal by
Appeals.
certiorari. It is not an original petition. And the assumption there is that it has gone through a certain amount of levels of courts before it gets to the Supreme Court. Is that not correct?
Yes, and that is why the doctrine of not disturbing the factual findings of the lower court
Yes.
come into play.
In petitions for habeas corpus, in your experience, and I understand that you have a lot of experience in habeas corpus, has there been situations in the past, even in the 1980s, where the Supreme Court actually dealt with factual issues?
Many cases in terms of habeas corpus where allegations were made by the petitioners that were denied or contradicted by the return of the respondents.
In fact, as a young lawyer, one of the first cases where I assisted your father was in a actual habeas corpus case assigned to a commissioner to deal with the facts of the case, and that commissioner was a regional trial court judge in Quezon City.
Yes, Your
who-
Honor. I
yes.
also recall a case where the court delegated to the physician of the Supreme Court and two other doctors the examination of the petitioners in terms of allegation of torture.
Okay. The Supreme Court sits as the Presidential Electoral Tribunal. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. And the PET deals with factual issues. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
In fact, we have actually about, if I'm not mistaken, and if Justice Kagiwa will correct me in the future, we have about 50 revision tables which have already done their part in revision. We have a group of 3 commissioners to look at the appreciation of the interpretation of the ballots. We have preliminary appreciation committees to help the court deal with the factual issues in that case. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And in the cases of habeas corpus and PET, some habeas corpus cases, not all, it may be of such a quality of a controversy where the Supreme Court wants to maintain its jurisdiction in order to, perhaps because it is novel, provide guidance to lower courts on how to deal with future cases of a similar import. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. Now, there is this new case of Gio Samar. And one of the reasons why hierarchy of courts is to be respected is principally to do the filtering before it goes to the court. Is that not correct?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm familiar
Yes.
with that case.
Yes, but would you know what types of cases go to the Supreme Court in bulk? Aren't these 45 cases, but not Rule 65 cases, or even the extraordinary jurisdiction of the court?
Well, I do not have the data in my possession, but I would imagine that there would be more
Well, just to be clear,
appeals.
Cases reach the court through Rule 45, that is by appeal. Automatic appeals coming from the regional trial courts in relation, and the Court of Appeals in relation to penalties involving life imprisonment and reclusion perpetua, correct? And of course, there is the original petition of 65, the special proceedings of habeas corpus, amparo, etc., and many others. Is that not correct?
That is
Yes.
correct, Your Honor.
Now, the Supreme Court can have original jurisdiction for some of these cases, even if it is at first instance because of the importance of that case. Isn't that true?
There is much precedent to support that, Your Honor.
Yes. And therefore, when we filter cases in order to reduce the docket of the court so that we can focus on the important issues, we must be careful not to filter the important issues. Is that not correct?
I believe that is why we have the doctrine of transcendental importance,
Yes.
Your Honor.
And if we do that, we filter all the cases, even the transcendentally important ones, we weaken the ability of this court to immediately address questions where the public wants a statement on the rule of law or the interpretation of law at that moment. Is that not correct?
That is correct, Your Honor.
Yes. And when we weaken the Supreme Court's powers, then we weaken the rule of law. Would you agree with me?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. Anyway, I am sure that some of my colleagues will ask more interrogative questions on the issues of fact that you may have raised in your petition.
If you want more, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a video.